Hello, everybody. Good evening. And thank you to Spoor Initiative for hosting us yet another time. Zeit zu Reden International tonight. We are having awareness teams from the Spoor Initiative who are wearing the yellow vests for anybody who feels uncomfortable and wants to get some backup. So good evening, everybody in the auditorium, people who are maybe sitting outside in the entrance hall and at home. We are having a live stream on Instagram and on YouTube. Welcome to Zeit zu Reden International, which is our English edition, and it's the third panel that we are doing with international guests. We had an English panel on German memory culture and one on genocide last year, and me and my colleagues Ido Arad and Heiko Kassian are very happy to see this turnout tonight because it shows that yes, people are interested in some critical input on certain issues that are difficult to discuss in Germany. And today's theme, sanctions and boycotts, is definitely one that needs some expertise from abroad to advance the discourse here in Germany. Although we had already a discussion in German last Saturday in Munich, we were invited at the Münchner Friedenskonferenz, the peace conference, which is the alternative to the security conference in Munich. And 350 people attended there. It was a huge turnout as well. We had a very deep and frank discussion in Munich. It was a warm and engaging audience and atmosphere. So it was good to see that Zeit zu Reden is possible in Munich. And that there are so many people, I mean, you are laughing because you are in Berlin, yes, I know, but there are a lot of people outside Berlin who are interested in these kind of discussions, so that's good to see. Tonight we want to take it a little further and discuss the topic in greater detail and with a focus on Israel. This is necessary because a lot of people in Germany are frustrated, some of them are outraged. They feel powerless, they feel paralyzed by the fact that Germany continues to export weapons to the state of Israel, even though Israel is being accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. And no legal action has yet been successful in stopping these deliveries. The German government justifies these exports as part of its special relationship towards Israel, arguing with the famous Staatsräson. And it has even declared Israel a premium partner for cybersecurity and military cooperation. So it's no longer just about exporting spare parts for Israeli tanks, but it's as well about importing technology, drone technology, for example, from Israel to Germany. So there's a growing interdependence between the two countries. There are regular visits in both directions. High-ranking police and security officials from Germany go to Israel. And at the same time, representatives from the Israeli government, from Israeli institutions are invited to Germany. At the same time, public sentiment has shifted over the past 2.5 years. And we saw different polls over the last year that showed that the large majority of Germans, and some surveys even say that it's more than 80%, support the restriction of arms deliveries to Israel, because these people don't want to be complicit. They don't want to be complicit in what is going on in Palestine and Israel. And when you look at the reality in Gaza right now and the reality of in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, you see that things are getting worse, actually. You have an ongoing occupation, displacement, even ethnic cleansing, we just heard today, destruction of homes, attacks by settlers, laws that normalize apartheid, laws that aim at annexation. And in Gaza, despite all the talking about ceasefire and a second phase and the so-called Board of Peace, who met today for the first time, crimes are ongoing in Gaza, crimes that, according to experts, amount to genocide. So what can you do as a German? What can you do as a German if you don't want to be complicit? If you don't want Germany to forget about the main and universal lesson learned from Nazi Germany, from Nazi rule, from the Holocaust, which is never again to anyone, anywhere, then what do? You think about peaceful strategies against these crimes. You think about non-violent action that would put pressure on the Israeli government, like a boycott or like sanctions. And then if you do that in Germany, you are confronted with a narrative and a public discourse that delegitimizes the very idea of boycotting Israel. And this is what we want to challenge tonight. We want to challenge this taboo with today's debate. We felt that we have to discuss the idea of boycotting Israel in Germany with people who know what works, I mean, how boycotts and sanctions can be successful, for example, in the past, in the case of apartheid South Africa, people who can explain what is needed in the case of Israel, people who can explain the BDS movement, what it is about, and what are the allegations and the accusations against it, and who can talk a little bit and explain Germany's quite effective campaign against BDS. So all this expertise is sitting here. And I'm very happy to introduce my panelists, my guest of tonight. Andrew Feinstein works as an investigative writer, broadcaster, campaigner, and activist in the UK. He's executive director of Shadow World Investigations, which is a small NGO that researches and exposes the impact of bribery on corruption on governance, with a focus on the global arms trade. He wrote a famous book. It's considered to be a standard work on the subject, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. It was made a movie, I think, as well, a documentary. Andrew was born in South Africa. He joined the African National Congress, the ANC. He was elected in South Africa's first democratic elections following the abolition of apartheid. And he served as a member of parliament under Nelson Mandela up to 2001. He's the son of a Holocaust survivor. Your mother is from Austria. And he introduced the first motion to commemorate the Holocaust in the history of the South African parliament. So he's a campaigner against all forms of racism and oppression. A warm welcome to you, Andrew Feinstein. Sophia Hoffinger is a senior monitor project officer at the European Legal Support Center, the ELSC, documenting the repression and ongoing criminalization of Palestine solidarity in Germany. Sophia completed her PhD in social anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, with a thesis that analyzed the racial politics in the context of the struggle over BDS in Germany. So this is why we need you here tonight. A warm welcome to Sophia Hoffinger. And Neve Gordon is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Queen Mary University of London. He's a Fellow of the British Academy for the Social Sciences. And before moving to the UK, Neve was teaching for 17 years at Ben Gurion University in Israel. He wrote several books. The first one was Israel's Occupation. He was co-author of The Human Right to Dominate and Human Shields, a history of people in the line of fire, which is still a focus of your research, the term human shields and how is it treated in legal terms. Neve was the first director of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, and he is a board member of the International State Crime Initiative. A warm welcome to you as well, Neve. Jordan. Now let's start by understanding a little bit the difference between sanctions and boycotts. Usually people think that sanctions is something official. It's legally binding, it's something that governments impose, whereas boycotts is something that, or is perceived something like a grassroots action, bottom up, to pressure companies or entities, and that it comes from groups or individuals. Would you agree to that? Is it that simple to have like bottom up is boycott and sanctions is top down, or are there more differences to take into consideration, Neve?
First of all, thank you for the organizers for inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for that beautiful introduction.
You have to put the micro so very
So sanctions are an act or a policy or that is decided by the state, and it is a state action. And therefore, it is often conceived of also as something that is legal. It has often in the past been considered as a weapon of peace, as opposed to a violent weapon, which again is problematic, and it's not the case. And and this kind of legality gives it a certain kind of legitimacy, which can often be extremely also problematic. If we're thinking, for example, now, I just have in my hand Francesca Zalbanese's last report, and she's under sanctions, and there's no legality for these sanctions. It's a kind of act of violence against her and against people that are in touch with her. And it's sanctions that are, in this case, are basically against providing information to the International Criminal Court. And so the International Criminal Court is now sanctioned, Francesca Albanese is sanctioned, and of course Russia is sanctioned. And all these are supposedly the same kind of sanctions. We can see they're very different, but they all come from state actors. Boycott is usually conceived, as you said, as a kind of grassroots, popular mobilization against something that people believe is morally outrageous, okay? And so it comes from the bottom in order to bring about some kind of change. I'll say one more thing and then let others. I think it's important to understand that boycott and sanctions are not a principle. When we say we support BDS, that's not a principle. It's a strategy. And the BDS comes with a certain, and we'll discuss that, I imagine, later, a certain number of demands. And if those demands are met, then the boycott stops. It's a strategy. So both sanctions and boycotts are a strategy. They're never a principle. It's not something that we say, for example, that someone would say, we should boycott Israel, full stop. No, we should boycott Israel until A, B, and C are met.
Now, you were talking about people doing morally infamous things, but state do morally very bad things. I mean, we have the war of aggression by Russia, we have genocide, we have apartheid. So there are states who do things that would be considered something that needs to be stopped. Now, the argument goes, instead of intervening militarily, let's find a more peaceful or at least non-violent means, which are sanctions. And this is the whole idea, to stop people or to have them comply by international law through sanctions, which is maybe in the cases of very bad crimes, the ones that I just mentioned, it's not a bad idea. Or would you say that all kinds of sanctions are a violent means, such as directly military intervention? I mean, this is the idea, to stop people or to maybe make the price a little bit higher for regimes or for power brokers, to have them stop what they do or to raise the price that they have to pay to make them change their behavior. I mean, the idea is to have an economic cost to make them change their behavior. Do you have an example where this worked out? Or what would be a very bad example where this did not happen, for example? Talking about countries, not individuals.
I mean, there's so much in what you said that I have to respond to. So first, states are the problem often, mostly. I mean, the states are the ones that carry out the most violence in the world. They're the ones that kill the most civilians in the world. So this idea that the states are the moral actor coming to bring about sanctions against immoral actors is problematic. That they do so in favor of international law? No, they're now sanctioning the major body of international law, the ICC. So it's not as if states are there to bolster international law, to enforce international law, and to require accountability, and to end this culture of impunity of countries or actors that kill civilians. States are using sanctions and have used sanctions in order to advance often economic interest. I mean, the worst case of sanctions in modern history is the Iraq War, where the sanctions were used and killed an estimated 500,000 people. So they can be weapons of violence. And that was not about justice. That was not about bringing about a better life for the civilians and the citizens of Iraq. And sanctions we can add, and maybe I'll end there and allow my fellow. One of the issues with sanctions like that in the Iraq case teaches us is that they're indiscriminate, right? So when you sanction a country fully without, it can be a very violent thing to do. In terms and violent and indiscriminate, so that tens of thousands of children and more died in Iraq due to the sanctions.
This is why they developed then the smart sanctions, you know, to avoid humanitarian.
Francesca Albanese and the ICC.
Yes,
that's
we all agree on Francesca Albanese. But going back to the idea of, yes, I mean, the three aims of sanctions are coercing, so you try to enforce a change of behavior to a certain government, constraining, which restricts the scope of action, and signaling to others, which is important because you don't want people to do the same, you know, some kind of, to uphold international legal standards to a certain extent. So the whole idea of putting sanctions has developed over the past decades. Maybe, Sophia, you can talk a little bit about this, because the idea was to avoid these humanitarian effects that we saw in Iraq, obviously, with a full blockade. Now you have a lot of humanitarian exceptions. You have what they call smart sanctions. We see huge packages and financial constraints. And what would you say, are these sanctions now being formulated and realized in a way that that is less harmful, at least, towards civilians? Do the smart sanctions work that smart, as smart as they sound?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think what, just to follow up on what you were saying, Neve, I think one of the important things to consider with sanctions is always what is the political aim behind the sanctions, right? And I think whether that's with smart sanctions or with like full-fledged sanctions, if there's for example, imperial interests at heart or economic interests, then I don't necessarily think that the differentiation between smart sanctions and full-state sanctions are so important, because we can very much see the political aim of certain sanctions, right? Also in targeting individuals or certain institutions, I think it's very clear. I think in the case of the sanctions that we're talking about, it's also quite interesting because, right, if we're considering the history of not only sanctions against Iraq, against Venezuela, right, and all these different ways that try to affect regime change, for example, it's an interest, and all of the human costs involved, right? There's a big question of why is this part of maybe also this set of tactics, right? From boycotts to sanctions and so on. And I think maybe also here it's important always, both with boycotts and with sanctions, to think about who is it targeting, what kind of relationship is it targeting? And in the case of Palestine, for example, it is always within the context, right, of still a self-determination struggle also. So it's not kind of a sovereign US state, for example, targeting another country, but it's part of, it's one tactic in, yeah, still a broader struggle for self-determination, I think. Yeah.
I came across a sentence, a quote by two sanctions experts in Germany, Julia Grauvogel and Christian von Soest, who write that sanctions are now so firmly established as an instrument that their non-application would almost legitimize a breach of international law, which would mean, in the case of Israel, the fact that the EU and the US do not respond to Israel's violations of international law with sanctions legitimizes these violations, right? Would you agree, Andrew? You know, if you sanction everything that is...
Sure.
Yeah.
First of all, just thank you so much for putting this event on and for the invitation. I think it's so important that these conversations are happening, and it's really good to be here. No, I think that's a nonsense, frankly. Because I don't believe we any longer live in a rules-based order. And I say that not just because of the situation in Gaza and Palestine generally, but because for the last 25 years I've been investigating and researching the global trade in weapons. And we have national legislation around arms export controls, including in Germany. We have it at a regional level. We have the EU common position on arms export controls. And we have it at international levels, the Arms Trade Treaty passed at the UN in 2014, I think. But states basically sell weapons to whoever they want to. And in most of these states that are weapons selling, the courts will not uphold challenges to the government for particular arms sales. We're seeing that in a variety of states at the moment in relation to Gaza. We've seen it for the last 11 years in relation to Yemen, where there are overwhelming documentary evidence of violations of international humanitarian law. But obviously Gaza is the most palpable example. So, you know, this notion that, well, if a country isn't sanctioned, then that country is great, is simply ignoring the reality.
No, but they're saying the contrary. They are putting their fingers in this double moral thing. They are saying that whenever it's so normalized to put sanctions, so whenever you don't sanction Israel, this means that you are legitimizing these war crimes, which is correct as a description. As a description, you know. I mean, we are sanctioning what, you know.
If we're not sanctioning Israel,
of
course that is a form, I would argue, a form of complicity in war crimes. Yeah. But if you look at the countries we do sanction, I mean, so I suppose it's the first part of the assumption that I would disagree with. It's a basis of a balance of power, and it's a basis of imperialism. And it depends who are the enemies of the most powerful states in the world. And at the moment, if we're going to take what are seen as the most powerful states in the world, the so-called Western world, as the moral parameter, then we're in very deep trouble, which is the reality of what we do.
Now, you were talking about the weapons deliveries. This is not supposed to be a political decision, actually, to do it or not do it, but it would be a legal obligation to not deliver weapons, right? If you,
yeah, of course.
If you follow international law. So maybe, Sophia, there is, for example, from a European perspective, to suspend the EU association agreement would be a necessity. It's not a choice. It's not a political decision, right? Because there's a human rights clause. Or when we talk about labeling products from illegal settlements. So this is one aspect as well of sanctions. It's not something that you can decide or not decide, but it should be applied because it's part of the legal obligations, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think also, I mean, not only should it be applied on a European level, right, but there have been several advisory opinions that have been issued only also on the illegality of the occupation, right, just this last summer by the ICJ and so on. And Germany, of course, also has an obligation to do something about them, because that's also enshrined in Germany's basic law, right, Article 25, whatever, it's enshrined to follow these international legal orders, especially when they concern specific crimes, right, such as the crime of apartheid, genocide, etc. But at the same time, the EU is also, like, one of the reasons why the EU is also not, I think, not disengaging from the trade agreement, etc., is because it's also Israel's largest trading partner, right? I think over 30% of Israel's total trade in goods is with the EU and so on. And so these are also big stakes, big economic stakes that I think are preventing this from happening, yeah.
So this is the reason why Europe is not adhering to its own principles, right? So that's economic interests, the short answer, or something else.
I mean, that would be one of the answers. But I think the second answer that is perhaps more important and that covers the economic and everything else is political will. So there are different arrangements for different states. So yes, of course, in an ideal world, you have a situation where there are these sorts of things in place, they always get adhered to. In the real world, that isn't the case because of geopolitics and the reality of political will. So that, you know, depending on the state who is committing the offenses will determine whether anything applies to them. And Israel, of course, as we know, is almost always an outlier.
So it's clear that sanctions is a legal obligation to a certain extent. It's something that governments do. Boycotts are voluntary measures taken by consumers, by individuals. But there's yet another tool, which is called divestment, and which is a concept that is not very well known, I think, in Germany. So maybe, Neve, you can talk a little bit about this. I mean, this is about withdrawing money from certain companies, right? But how does it work exactly?
So I think that the most powerful tool now at our disposal is actually, even more so than boycott, is divestment. And divestment is to take the money that we are investing in Israeli apartheid, in Israeli genocide, and to stop that investment. Now, what is that money? That money is your pension fund, okay? Most people in this room have a pension fund. Our pension funds are billions and billions of euros. We need to see, it's our money. It's our money. We need to decide where that money is invested. Why do we need to invest our money in war machines? Okay? So the first place to organize, I think, is vis-a-vis our own pension funds. Anyone that works and has a pension, organize people from the same pension fund and begin making demands and begin about, first do the research, find out where your pension fund is investing. That's open source. They have to tell you where they're investing. Do the actual research, find out where your pension fund is investing. You'll be horrified. Your money is now invested in the war machine in Gaza. You'll find that out. That it's invested in Palantir, that it's invested in Elbit, that it's invested in Israeli aerospace, that it's invested in Rafael, etc., etc., etc. So I think that is the best tool at our disposal. And it's not, I think it's about ethical investment in general. So as someone that has children and is concerned about the climate, I also don't want to give fossil fuels money, etc., etc. So this is a tool at our disposal. In several countries, there are working groups now that are researching the biggest pension funds, and the pension funds are part of the biggest investors in the stock markets, right? So we need to see what they're doing and to start mobilizing against that. We can also think of other investment institutions that we can pressure to divest from. So in terms of strategy and what we as individual citizens can do with a bit of collective action, never alone, always with a collective, what we can do with a collective here is quite outstanding, and there have been disinvestments due to such outcries. And if we can get the ball rolling, it would be really important.
Now we're already in the part of giving advice. I mean, that was supposed to be at the end, or not at all, as we want to discuss this and see how it works and to understand how this works. Now let's look a little bit at the case of South Africa, because all these measures that we just discussed in theory were used against the apartheid regime in South Africa. It seems to be the only example, correct me if I'm wrong, the only example in history where an almost complete embargo led to a positive outcome, we would say, from today's point of view. So what kind of boycott was that, Andrew? I mean, it was very long. It was for several decades.
Yeah.
Okay, so how was it upheld, and were there no unwanted negative effects?
So what happened against South Africa, apartheid South Africa, was a combination of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There were certain state-driven sanctions in place. I mean, there was an arms embargo, there was an oil embargo. They were broken all the time by pretty much everybody, but they were in place.
Who put them in place, exactly?
So the UN primarily.
The UN as a whole, not single
The
countries.
UN primarily, the oil and arms embargoes particularly. But they were broken by countries, including countries that were sympathetic to the liberation struggle. There's a brilliant book called Apartheid, Guns and Money by someone called Henny van Vuren that documents the fact that, for instance, the Soviet Union, where a lot of the ANC's cadres were actually educated and trained, was still doing business with the apartheid state. Not on the scale of Britain or Germany or the United States, but they still were. Then the second dimension of it is almost a combination of boycott and divestment. So there were a lot of calls for a boycott of Royal Dutch Shell, which was the primary provider of oil to the apartheid military. Now, the reality is that part of the boycott was never successful, in that Royal Dutch Shell continued to provide oil until the end of apartheid. But it did place enormous pressure and a focus on the company, and we did see a small decline in its profitability at the height of that boycott, when in the UK in particular, Holland to some extent, because those are the two home bases of the company, we saw that people would just drive past a Shell petrol station onto whatever was next, because there was this association of Shell with support for apartheid. But then the most interesting, and I think the most important, was the divestment and boycott strategy, which came together in relation to the banks. And there were two banks in particular that were targeted, Barclays Bank in the UK, and a bank that was then known as Chase Manhattan in the US, that today I think is called JP Morgan Chase or something similar. Now, the reason they were targeted is because they were the most important bankers to the apartheid state. And what does that mean? That means that they basically facilitate the ability of that state to generate foreign exchange for its foreign trade, one. Two, to provide that state with debt, and to do so at a low rate. So to provide cheap debt, effectively. And there was a group of 20 banks that did that, but Chase Manhattan and Barclays were the most important of them. So they were a strategic target in that sense. But as importantly, they provide retail consumer services to ordinary people. And there was an incredibly successful campaign in the US and the UK to encourage students to close their accounts in those two banks or not to take accounts with those two banks. And it got to the point where the senior executives of these banks realized it was so effective that they were going to lose out on an entire generation of customers. And that was really the root of the success of the sort of international dimension of BDS against the apartheid state.
That was before globalization, though.
Of course.
Yes.
I mean,
this makes it more difficult or easier. Maybe it makes it easier or more difficult.
I'm not sure. I think it probably is a bit more difficult because, if you look at those banks today, yes, while, they might in theory be based in London and New York, in practice they're based everywhere in the world. So you would need almost a total boycott across multiple countries rather than just two.
Now, there's a discussion among experts on how much the international sanctions and boycotts against South Africa contributed to the end of the apartheid regime, because there was internal resistance, there were negotiations at the end, between the National Party government and the ANC. So you were there, basically, Andrew, so deeply involved with the ANC at that time. From your experience, how important was the boycott?
Sure. So I think it's worth saying there were obviously myriad causes of the collapse of apartheid in South Africa. To ascribe it to one or two things would be absurd. To those that you've mentioned, I would add the South African military suffered a devastating defeat in Angola in a place called Quito Kinavale. And part of the apartheid state strategy was to effectively militarily defeat what it called the frontline countries on South Africa's borders, which were all democratic countries. And the idea was to turn them into supplicant states that would support this racist apartheid state. And that military defeat put an end to that strategy. The fact that the Cold War was coming to an end, because the apartheid intelligence services believed, erroneously as it turned out, that most of the ANC support came from the Soviet Union, whereas in fact it was from Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden. So the end of the Cold War didn't have the effect that apartheid intelligence thought it would have. They were also so stupid, which most intelligence agencies are, belying the name, that they also persuaded F.W. de Klerk, the last president of the apartheid state, who came from the right wing of an already far right-wing political party, that he could retain power. That in a democratic election, the ANC wasn't nearly as popular as the ANC itself made out, and that he would win a huge percentage of the white vote, and that he would be able to win a significant enough percentage of the moderate black vote to stay in power, which was a total absurdity to anyone who had a little bit of intelligence. Yeah. Exactly. But what was absolutely crucial, and I can't stress this enough, that I believe was really the final trigger that led to the downfall of apartheid in South Africa, was the fact that because of the financial and economic boycotts and divestments, the quality of life of ordinary white South Africans started to decline. The day-to-day quality of life. Everything became more expensive. It became more and more difficult to travel abroad. We couldn't play sport against anybody but ourselves. Because in South Africa, we had a sort of a hierarchy under apartheid of what was important to us. Rugby was right at the top. Racism was second and religion was third.
So but rugby more important than racism?
Than racism, yeah. And the reality is that when our quality of life started to decline, which was really about those banks and about the fact that they massively increased the costs of debt and foreign exchange to the South African state, so that our debt to GDP ratio went skyrocketing up and everything became much more expensive. You got to the point where there weren't certain products that had always been available, and where there was a shortage of a lot of things, and where everything became significantly more expensive. And this led to a sort of a two-way fracture politically. On the one hand, some of the whites moved to a sort of an even further far right-wing party that effectively wanted to eliminate all black people in the country, something called the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging, or Afrikaner resistance movement. And on the other side, led some people to push for change. And I think that was the most crucial thing. But the fact that BDS played a critical role, along with a whole lot of other factors, and last one I'll mention, is that there was wave after wave of general strikes in the country by black workers. And that, together with these financial penalties and strictures, was really what brought the economy to its knees, and the country, to an extent, first of all, became poorer, and second of all, became more and more difficult to govern.
Now let's look at the two systems, and what are the similarities and what are the differences between the apartheid system in South Africa and the realities on the ground in Israel. Because obviously, I mean, the demographics are very different, if you look at 10%, 90%. So what are the similarities? Maybe let's start with the similarities. Yeah. What would you...
So I am going to talk about one difference, but the obvious similarities, these are both, in my opinion, systems of settler colonialism, where people believed, that a people without land were coming to a land without people. And that's what we were taught in school history, in white government schools in South Africa. And then later on in history, we were taught about all these battles that these people who had come to find this land with no people, but then they were fighting against all sorts of indigenous people in various wars. And I remember asking my history teacher and saying to him, well, if there were no people here when they arrived, who were they fighting against? Themselves. And I was just kicked out of the class for suggesting that. But so some of the founding myths were the same. One thing that is overlooked to some extent, and it is on a very different scale, obviously, you know, the experience of the Holocaust amongst Jews and that as a motivation for Zionism. Afrikaans-speaking South Africans who came predominantly from France, from Holland, Flanders, they were actually put in what they described as concentration camps in South Africa by the British at various stages of their history. And they claimed that what they were doing to create this racist South African state was a form of a response to having been in concentration camps. Now, we are talking about a very different scale. And I'm not sure historically exactly when that narrative started. It might have conveniently started after the Second World War for obvious reasons. But the other similarity is obviously the balkanization of the countries. So, you know, we had 13 independent Bantustans or homelands, which to some way are reflected in the way in which the occupied territories have constantly been balkanized to ever greater extent. And there are a variety of other similarities which we don't have time to go into. I do want to just note one really important difference, because I think it comes down to behavior. And that is that apartheid South Africa was totally dependent on the labor of black South Africans to keep the economy going. Because our economy is predominantly a natural resource-based economy, we needed to mine various substances out of the ground. And that's horrible work, and white South Africans didn't want to do that work. So there was this massive black workforce. And that's one of the reasons why both Nelson Mandela and a very close friend and mentor of mine, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, actually described apartheid in Israel-Palestine as more brutal and worse than in South Africa, is because the Israeli state doesn't have the same level of economic dependence on a Palestinian workforce as the South Africans did on a black workforce. So for the South Africans to massacre tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of its own workforce just didn't make basic economic sense. So we had awful massacres. We had Sharpeville, we had Soweto, we had a whole lot of other less known ones. But at their worst, we were talking about 400 to 500 people. You know, we're talking on the scale today of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people massacred. So I think that's a really important difference to bear in mind.
Neve, when you talk about apartheid in Israel, what do you mean exactly? Do you mean the situation in the occupied territories? Do you mean different legal systems for Palestinians and Israelis, differences between Jews and non-Jews in Israeli territories of 48? How would you define that?
So when I began talking about apartheid, people thought I was talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which I wasn't. The reason they thought I was talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip and maybe East Jerusalem is that you have a single, Israel's borders are ambiguous, because the international borders are the 1967, pre-1967 borders, the recognized borders according to the UN, and then there's the occupied territories. So if Israel's borders are from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean Sea, then you have a population living in that area under very different legal regimes, where you have several million people living under either military orders or Jordanian law or Egyptian law, which is the kind of, and international humanitarian law. And then you have citizens of Israel, supposedly. And so people thought when I said apartheid that I meant it's only in relation to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where at the time there was also settlers in the Gaza Strip and so forth, and that they live in the same same space, and they're under two regimes. Two legal regimes, and there's this separation. There's roads only for Jews, and there's roads for the Palestinians, etc., etc. Probably everyone here knows that. But what I actually meant when I first began speaking about apartheid,
which was in 2009, right?
Before, that's when I wrote that article. No, probably around 2000, is actually from the Jordan Valley to it's all one big apartheid. First, because Israel's been controlling that area for 70 years and is not going to give it up. And so it's clear there's one space. Israel understands itself as the sovereign of that one space. We have millions of people that live under a different regime. But even if we took this imaginary thing that there is a green line and somehow that green line is important, and so is there apartheid in Israel? So before that, if there is a green line and it's not part of Israel, then how do 5 ministers in the government live outside the country? You know, it just doesn't make sense, right? How do the Supreme Court judges live outside the country? But what you have inside Israel is also a Jewish supremacist regime, that there's certain laws, probably around, if you go into the website of the human rights organization Adala, they have a database of laws, probably around 20-25 laws, that privilege, that give more rights to a person because they're Jewish, okay, or because of their ethnicity. Obviously, the most obvious of these is the right of return. Any Jew anywhere in the world can come to Israel and immediately get citizenship, while today millions of Palestinian refugees whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents were born in Palestine and who should have a right of return based on UN Resolution 194 do not have that right, cannot enter. And when Human Rights Watch wants to publish a report, was it 2 weeks ago, that said that denying the Palestinians a right of return is a crime against humanity, that report suddenly is shelved and never sees the light of day. I can say that in around 2000, the Israeli organization B'Tselem also wrote a report about the Palestinian right of return. And guess what? Also that report never saw the light of day. The Palestinian right of return is considered a major threat by Israel, something that Israel will never, and it's considered a major threat because of this idea of demographic warfare, and the demographic warfare is a concept because of the idea of hierarchy between people and of supremacy of one people and not. And then we have a whole series of other laws. Probably the second most important among these is the 2018 nation-state law, where it says very clearly that settlements have to be, that it's a Jewish, I would even say commandment, mitzvah, to settle the land and to gain control of the land. There's a whole series of aspects within that law that creates this hierarchy, this supremacy of one group over another group, and that is apartheid. So what we see here is, yes, it's a settler colonial state. But at the heart of settler colonialism is also always a regime of racial supremacy, okay? And the racial aspect becomes extremely important, which makes it so difficult in a way to understand the German government.
Okay, we come to the German government in a moment. But what are because you have been listening to what Andrew said about the case of South Africa, and maybe first to you the question and then to you, what would be the lessons learned then from the South African example and how to be applied in the case of Israel?
With relation to BDS specifically, or?
Yes, I mean, what you saw in South Africa
Sure.
working out, what could be applied on the case of Israel?
Well, I think, we know that the Israeli state, which, let's remind ourselves, was apartheid South Africa's closest ally. They enabled each other to become nuclear powers. They provided military training and weaponry to each other. We had a prime minister, B.J. Vorster, who had been jailed during the Second World War because of his Nazi sympathies. He was involved in a Nazi militia called the Ossewa Brandwacht. And he made a trip to Israel, and his first stop was at Yad Vashem, where, he did all the normal niceties. And I couldn't understand why my mother was literally frothing at the mouth watching this. And she said, he's a bloody Nazi. And he then did the nuclear deal with, I can't remember whether it was Perez or Rabin who was in power at that point. And so they were incredibly, incredibly close. And the Israeli state has been very conscious of how successful BDS was in ending apartheid in South Africa. And that is why I believe that there was a very explicit strategy to try and link in an equivalency support for BDS with anti-Semitism as an attempt to try and stop or curtail support for BDS because they'd seen how effective it had been. What are the lessons that we learned in South Africa? As you mentioned, BDS went on for decades. Some people think our struggle was a quick one because they sort of came to know about the struggle when Nelson Mandela was released. That was very much the tiny ending of our struggle. The ANC was founded in 1912 to end apartheid. We achieved a degree of liberation in 1994. And we're still struggling for a degree of economic liberation because today South Africa is the most unequal country on the world, and that inequality is racially based. So it
has been 35 years of sanctions, right? Almost. I mean, more than 3 decades.
Yeah.
Which is something that
and, the sanctions were all over the place. There were loads of targets. Very few people in the international world knew what they were supposed to be targeting. It was down to sort of personal preference, national preference, and various other things. And that was also because our liberation movement wasn't one unified movement. It wasn't just the ANC. We had the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was a breakaway from the ANC. We had the Azanian People's Organization, which was a black consciousness movement coming out of the philosophy of Steve Biko. And they all had differences about what BDS should look like. It was only in the later years, the 1980s, where the liberation movement to some extent got its act together, if you will, to unify around what the targets would be and, crucially importantly, to limit those targets. And then this unrelenting campaign about the or immorality, Neve would probably have insight to that better than me, of this racist white supremacist system, where even where governments were supportive of the apartheid state, they couldn't do so overtly. They had to give that support covertly or secretly because it was seen as so beyond the pale morally to be supporting the state. And that only really happened in the 80s. So I think it was the number of targets, the precision of the targeting, and the unification of the liberation movement that were incredibly important. And then we were geopolitically very lucky. that a number of factors came to confluence at the same time when we had one leader in Nelson Mandela who had enormous standing, and not just because he was a great guy, which he was, but because that had been a very conscious strategy of the liberation movement to build Mandela up. You know, his very famous autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, wasn't just written by him. It was written by about 20 of them when they were in jail, and it was transcribed by one of them, Mac Maharaj, who had the smallest handwriting. And he wrote it down as they all composed it together on toilet tissue. And because he had the shortest sentence, he smuggled it out with him when he got out of jail. I've never asked him how, and I'm not sure I want to know. So this was a very clear strategy, but I think the lessons of it coalesce around a small number of targets, unify the leadership. Even if you have differences, don't play out those differences in public. Present a unified opposition to the racist system of apartheid, at least publicly. And then, unfortunately, one does need myths to propagate, because Mandela, by his own admission, was a myth in his own lifetime.
Now let's look a little bit more closely to BDS. And Neve, you were one of the people who quite early endorsed BDS inside Israel. I mean, we just listened to you explaining why Israel was an apartheid state, so it's logical that you followed or that you joined BDS in 2009, but you paid kind of a high price because you left the country then, you went into exile. But I have to ask you that again, what made you as a Jewish Israeli to be on the privileged side in this within the country? What made you think that it needs a boycott of your own country to change its political course?
It's a long story. But it is, because I grew up in a Zionist family. In a Zionist community. I went to the military. I did what the kind of Israeli Jew does. And it was, I did become active early on in my late teens and in my 20s, and slowly my position changed through interaction with Palestinians and through talking. Israel's a very segregated society. 99% of all the villages, towns, cities are either Jewish or Palestinian. Not by law, but they are, okay? And since schools are according to where you live, you won't meet, as a Jew, often a Palestinian, maybe until you're a military, and then you're meeting them with a M16 in your hand. Okay, so it's this kind of society that you grow up in. You don't meet the other. You don't have real conversations, and it's only when, through my activism, that things began to change. I can say about myself that I began my activism as a white savior. Okay, this idea of the white man coming to save the indigenous population. So it's constant self-reflection about what you're doing, constantly meeting Palestinians that would challenge, even as I was trying to be part. Initially, I would say I'd come to help. They say, we don't want your help. We don't come to help us. Come join us in the liberation struggle. Okay, it's a very different approach. Once I'd say I interviewed an Israeli activist. I said, when did you join the peace camp? He said, I never joined the peace camp. I'm in the anti-colonial camp. And these are very different perspectives. And at one point, when my children were small, still now they're in university, I had 2 boys. I know the trajectory of boys in Israel, and the racism is out there, and I did not want to raise my children in an apartheid regime. And I understood that my views are becoming more and more marginalized, more and more delegitimized, and that without the help of people like you, people outside of Israel, we're not going to bring about change. Our camp is shrinking, and I'm talking now already 15, 16 years ago when I wrote that article. Now things are much, much worse. Our camp is shrinking, we don't have the power, we need the support from the international community to change the reality here. And that's when I wrote that article, and when I went to work a few days later at the university, the first person I saw, he said, "Are you wearing a bulletproof vest?" I said, "No."
Now, Sophia, we need you a little bit for the German mindset here, because
Ooh, that's terrible.
I know, but we have to talk about this, because for many Germans, really, and I'm serious, for many Germans, it is surprising that a Jew supports BDS, because it is being portrayed, and Andrew was talking about this strategy already, as an anti-Semitic movement, reminding us of the Nazi slogan, "Don't buy from Jews." This is the allegation here. So what's the logic behind this? What's the argument that is being
So it's very difficult to explain it as a logic, because also I think as we'll continue to explore, this is getting more and more and more absurd, right? So talk of logic is in itself difficult, but okay. So you promised an international panel. I'm here to represent what's happening, all the effort that Germany is going through to stop all of this from happening, and from even getting people to speak about just boycotts. But yes, so in 2019, and I can elaborate a little bit more later, the German parliament passed a resolution condemning BDS and defaming it as anti-Semitic, right? So as a form of anti-Jewish racism. And in this resolution was also not the first time this kind of narrative came about, but really in this resolution, what the German parliament did was draw a direct, historic, continuous line from the 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses in Nazi Germany to the BDS efforts and to the BDS efforts as a tactic today. So just because at the beginning we spoke about what are boycotts, are they always grassroots, right? They're not necessarily always grassroots. 1933 is a great example of a state-sponsored boycott against German Jewish citizens by a Nazi-fascist regime that was preceded by brown shirt militia, violent attacks, etc. And that is the kind of lineage that the German parliament sees BDS in, and saw it in 2019 when it made this kind of remark. I also think when you go back and listen to this, there's a recording of the debates around the passing of this resolution, and it's really astounding because all of the parliamentarians, everyone, denounces BDS as a tactic in its demands, etc. And the biggest injury is not an injury necessarily to Jews, but to a German historic sensibility, right? This is really what throughout comes out very, very strongly, that everyone is saying, not only is this an anti-Semitic tactic, but it's especially, it's soiling our memory as Germans, which is, it's an injury to this kind of historic memory and guilt and responsibility, etc.
I mean,
So-
the idea behind this is that Israel is like the Jew among the states. This is like what people are referring to sometimes. And practically they are referring to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And interestingly, I mean, we know that the author of IRA, Kenneth Stern, has during the last few years insisted that it was not meant to be a tool for censorship. So he kind of distanced himself, at least from how it is used over the past years. But there is another definition, which is the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism, that was developed by a group of scholars. Now it's, I think by now it's more than 370 signatories. It has more than 370 signatories. And I want to quote from this Jerusalem Declaration because they have an article on BDS, and it says, I quote, "Boycott, divestment and sanctions are commonplace, non-violent forms of political protest against states. In the Israeli case, they are not in and themselves anti-Semitic." So what do you as Jews, now Andrew and Neve, what do you say if somebody comes up to you in Germany and says, but this is BDS, this is anti-Semitic, this is against Jews, because it's, boy, you are not allowed to buy from Israel, Israelis, so this means it's like what the Nazis did. How would you respond to that?
What is going on with this IHRA definition and with this claim that BDS is anti-Semitism is a kind of logical syllogism. And it goes like this. I am a Jew, I'm an individual Jew, I'm part of the collective of Jews, and Israel is the state of the collective Jews. Therefore, an attack on Israel is an attack on the Jew. Okay, that is what the kind of false conflation, that is the move of the false conflation, and it's very powerful. It's very powerful, so when I come and teach, for example, Amnesty International's apartheid report in a human rights class, a Jewish student in the class can feel that I have offended them because they identify with the state.
Can you put the microphone a little bit closer?
They identify with the state, and therefore they feel that they have been offended. Now, our feelings are constructed, and Israel has tried to construct this idea that it is the Jewish state, that it represents all Jews in the world, and therefore any injury to the Jewish state in any format is an attack on the Jews. That's the strategy, and it comes from human rights even. It comes from this idea of the right to difference. So when you have a group, for example, if you're black or if you're smaller Ethiopian blacks, you say, we have our certain cultures, we have our certain history, we want to protect this. It's a kind of identity politics. What is unique to the IHRA is this extension of the right to difference of a collective group to a state. And the IHRA becomes Israel's Iron Dome. It becomes a counterinsurgency tool against criticism, first criticism of policies that were abusive of human rights, but now it's criticism of a genocide, okay? So it has become a tool, and so I'm saying in terms of my morality, the way I conceive the world, that I support action against these abuses of the law, abuses of human rights, and surely against a genocide. And therefore, I, as a Jew, not as a person, as a Jew, support the BDS. And to claim that that is anti-Semitic, that because of that, I hate Jews, that is where this false conflation goes the other direction. My criticism is not against Jews. My criticism is against the state. It's against a regime, a settler colonial regime. You dismantle the settler colonial regime. We don't need the BDS anymore.
You want to add something?
Just very quickly, I really wanted Neve to go first there because I knew he would be logical and rational about it. I find this very difficult.
So now
My
comes the non-logical answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. My first degrees were in clinical psychology, and I think this is reflective of a deep pathology. And part of this deep pathology is actually in and of itself anti-Semitic, because it has, as Neve has indicated, it has very deeply embedded in it this notion that all Jews think the same, which in itself is deeply racist and anti-Semitic. And, you know, the thing that I love about Judaism, that Neve will relate, and it doesn't apply only to Judaism, but Judaism is a good case in point. You know, we talk about the fact that if two Jews get stuck in a telephone box together, not that we have telephone boxes anymore, but you know what I mean, they're going to have sort of 35 opinions between them. And this is part of not just Jewish culture, but most cultures, and to try and reduce any peoples for your own psychological and political convenience to some sort of homogeneity and uniformity is really quite a repulsive act. And I think it's something we need to be very explicit about. Because Germany, in dealing with its own trauma and memory, is in fact replicating this notion of the good Jew and the non-good Jew who is not a Jew. And it's come to the fore in the last few years profoundly. You know, there have been Jews like Neve and others, especially in Israel, who've shown enormous courage to take the positions that they've taken. But because of what happened on the 7th of October and what has happened subsequently, there is this notion that Judaism is now determined by your political views. That if you do not have certain views about the state of Israel, then you aren't a proper Jew. You know, people like Neve and I are self-hating anti-Semitic Jews, anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jews, even in Israel itself, are somehow not proper Jews. And I mean, this is deeply dysfunctional and racist. And I think it's really, really important to call it out and to be very explicit about it.
Let's talk a little bit about the main demands of BDS. There are three main demands: ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands. Second is recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And third, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in the UN resolution 194. Now, what is, because now there are a lot of people who would agree with you that say, okay, that's not anti-Semitic, we agree on that. There's a lot of liberal Zionist Jews, a lot of Jews or intellectuals, they would say, yeah, it's not anti-Semitic, but still, you know, BDS, it's a problem because, you know, you cannot do this and that. There are other critical points. For example, saying that the description of Arab lands is too vague. You know, that somehow it's endangering the state of Israel. So maybe you could summarize a little bit what is being criticized by people who would agree that it has nothing to do with being anti-Semitic, but still it's to be criticized.
I mean, I think there are also those who, just to say that there are also, when in the context of, for example, passing this anti-BDS resolution, there were also those who said that actually, you know, the goals are fine, but the tactics and BDS anyways is an illegitimate format. So, because as you said, and as I think Neve already highlighted, like the importance of all of these, the three demands, there are also those, who don't have a huge issue with the demands, but the critiques against the demands are often on the basis of the kind of denial of the apartheid reality that Neve was describing, saying that, right, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, this kind of storyline that keeps still being repeated. And as well that, of course, the rights of return for Palestinians would kind of threaten Israel's right to exist, so-called, right? Whereas, in fact, obviously, this denial of return also needs to be understood as a part of also this ongoing genocide and the continuous displacement of Palestinians, and the idea that they can also be displaced to surrounding Arab countries because there's no coherent kind of national body, etc., etc. Right? This is also part of the denial of Palestinian peoplehood and so on. But yeah.
Wouldn't it be smarter then to clarify these things, Neve, from BDS side, to say that no, we are not questioning the state of Israel. We only mean this and this land, or we don't want to, with the right of return of all Palestinians. Obviously, there has to be a solution to that. This may be. People would argue, I'm quoting that, to avoid misunderstandings, that BDS itself is questioning the state of Israel and wants to get rid of a Jewish state. It could be clarified. These goals could be more precise, maybe.
I don't feel comfortable telling the Palestinians how to run the show. I think that there's something disingenuous in this kind of critique, because the people that voice it are saying, what are they saying? They're saying, these are the liberals, right? The liberals are the ones that are voicing this kind of critique. They're saying, we're against human rights violations, we're against discrimination, we're against supremacy, we're against this. But the problem is that the Palestinians don't know how to run their show. Okay, now you're committing these crimes, and then the complaint is that they're not clear enough what they want. Now, the BDS campaign, from my understanding of it, and in fact that was part of my critique of it in the human right to dominate, is based on a human rights approach. So I don't understand the liberal critique here, because basically they are basing the demands on UN resolutions and on human rights. And the imagination that Palestinians coming to the land between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean Sea is the annihilation of the Jews is a kind of self-reflection about what you're doing, the Jew, okay? Because that is not, it's nowhere in the BDS. If you open the website, it's on the website. Everything is on the website. It's nowhere written there. And it is the imagination coming from, they want to annihilate us, they want to eliminate us. Now, what is going on here, and this is where the issue is that regardless what Israel does, it is the victim. Okay, so the BDS, this kind of response is, I'm the victim here. You want to boycott me, I'm the victim. So you kill, the Palestinians killed 36 children on October 7th, in the massacre on October 7th. Israel has killed about 20,000 children in Gaza. We have to understand that. And how can you do that and still be the victim? And so this whole kind of response is, I'm the victim here. And we have to, the idea of the victimhood, once it enters into the soul and is internalized, it can lead to horrific acts.
Now, you were talking about the mindset of these liberal people who criticize BDS. A lot of them would say that there is and Sophia talked about it, that this is a wrong strategy because you are, for example, by the academic boycott or by boycotting certain personalities who represent institutions, that this would boycott potential allies, because these people are against Netanyahu government and they are against occupation, so they are the potential allies from within Israel to work with you. Yes, everybody's laughing here. I know. I have to make this argument, sorry. I have to make this argument that by aiming at scientists and scholars and artists and athletes, you know, that BDS is finally affecting potential allies and it's losing ground and support within the Israeli society that it deeply needs. What would you respond to that?
So I come from the academia, and and to call one of the criticism when I came about the BDS was, how do you call for people to boycott yourself? But we need to really understand what is the role of Israeli academia and what is this. So I went to speak here with not here, but in Holland, with several leaders of universities to try to talk to them about academic boycott. And everyone came exactly with your line. They said, but our friends, scholar friends in the Israeli academia, they're against the judicial overhaul, they're against Netanyahu, they're against all that. So there's two issues going on here. First, what is the role of Israeli academia in this occupation, genocide, colonialism thing? And second, what is the role of these people? So in terms of the academia, it has many roles. One of them in the sciences, it is the foundational research for a lot of the war machine, the surveillance machine. A lot of it stems from them there. In terms of the Zionist narrative, the archaeologists dig. Okay, so they dig. Instead of digging what's the next level, they skip hundreds and hundreds of years of Muslim existence under the land, erase it in order to show that there's something underneath it. It's all part of the same narrative. The language courses at the university are triggered towards intelligence, okay, towards intelligence forces and so forth. So but most of all, the role of the university is this image of Israel as a liberal democracy. And they play a role, an important role, in the production of this image. And this image is also a kind of defense against a boycott. We need to break this image, okay? So that is one thing. But then there are all my friends that went for 35 weeks before October 7th, or 55, I don't remember anymore, every Saturday to protest the judicial overhaul, to protect the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is a colonial court. It is a court that never really defended the rights of the Palestinians. It does defend my rights as a Jew. Okay, so they defended a court and they are against Netanyahu because he wants to bring in corruption to government, because he wants to destroy a court that will stop corruption, etc., etc. But it's all for the Jews. The supremacy, the basic idea of the supremacy was never challenged in those protests. In fact, it was enforced by the leaders of these protests. So being against Netanyahu, Foucault once said, it's not enough to chop the king's head off. The problem is the regime, okay? And in the Arab Spring, in Egypt, they didn't call for the downfall of Mubarak, they called for the downfall of the regime. And the problem here is the regime, and those liberal allies in the universities in Israel, not all of them, but most of them support the regime.
This is why you are saying that really the academic boycott is so important about the BDS.
The academic boycott, in my mind, is important because of this veneer of democracy, but it's also the easiest boycott. If we can't succeed in the academic boycott, then it will be very hard to succeed in other boycotts. And if we do succeed, it will pave the way for other boycotts, because the progressive voices in many countries are in universities. Okay, so that we need to, it's all a strategy. I said, BDS is a strategy, it's not a principle. We need to think about these things strategically. And so if we can't succeed in the academic boycott, I find it hard to believe that we'll succeed in the sports boycott, and we need the sports boycott. We need the sports boycott. So, but it has to go often through other stages to get there.
Andrew.
I think it's very important just to add to that. The academics and the cultural workers who were opposed to those dimensions of boycott during the apartheid state were those academics and cultural workers who supported the apartheid state. You know, the reality is that radical academics and radical cultural workers who were obviously affected by those boycotts, were totally supportive of them because they weren't wedded to this sort of liberal paradigm. Because it's equivalent in South Africa, which was obviously even more of a stretch than in Israel, which has never been a democracy since day one of its existence, obviously, is that South Africa was this sort of, you know, saving white Christianity from the sort of the heathen hordes that would destroy our way of life and everything else. So academics who were committed to the overthrow of the regime, which only happened partially in 1994, were totally supportive of the boycott. And the whole purpose of the boycotts, which is why, as Neve says, it's so important to extend that boycott academically, culturally, and on the sporting terrain, is because the population that benefit from the regime must understand that there are costs to the maintenance of that regime. That was its importance in the South African context, and that's why it remains so important in the context of Israel.
Now, there's another very sensitive issue, and you just mentioned it, talking about culture and artists against the backdrop of German history. It's very difficult to see the boycott of artists from Israel. You know, and we have two recent cases, and Sophia, I would ask you to show us again or to explain to us how Germany reacted to this. One is the Eurovision Song Contest, and the other one is the case of Israeli conductor Lahav Shani. Maybe some of you remember, he was disinvited from the Flanders Festival in Ghent in September 25. He was supposed to be with the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra. So how did Germany react in both cases, Sophia, and how typical is this line of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I don't have, so, it's on? Okay, yeah, perfect. So with Eurovision, it was kind of a classic, right? I don't know if you have been following it. I stopped following Eurovision a while ago, but then only sometimes peripherally think about it because this has been an ongoing debate, right? Like the question of whether Israel should be allowed to participate in Eurovision is also not a question that started in 2023. This is ongoing. Anyway, so this year, however, like a lot of countries decided to withdraw their participation if Israel wasn't like disinvited, exactly. And immediately Friedrich Merz went to the rescue and said, okay, if Israel gets disinvited, then Germany will withdraw, or like he would support the withdrawal of Germany's participation in the Eurovision Song Contest. I mean, okay, that's fine, I guess. Like, I don't know what I think the only thing that this is kind of showing is, on the one hand, this investment, right, of a German chancellor wanting to make a statement of in support of withdrawing an artist from this festival, which is, yeah, I think there is something to be said about the role of the arts and culture sector here and the influence that or the kind of credit that it's given, right, in kind of playing this role of mediation, but also of kind of, yeah, this form of diplomacy, the arena of diplomacy that plays. I'm not sure to what extent this kind of shows German support of Jewish artists, to be honest, because, I mean, one of the things that I've noted, and I mean, not only in my research, but also in our work at the ELSC, right, we have published a database where we are, where we've collected incidents of repression. A lot of them have to do with cancellations, silencing, and so on. And in 2020, for example, there was a big artist project called the School for Unlearning Zionism at the Weißensee Art School here in Berlin. It was organized by Israeli Jews and German Jews that wanted to kind of think beyond Zionism. They created an artistic and an academic program. And they were immediately, or not immediately, but not immediately, actually they were first smeared by various actors, including Volker Beck, a former parliamentarian here in, former Green Party parliamentarian, and also president of the German Israeli Society. And then eventually this project was defunded, right? But also by the Berlin Senate, by the university, and so on. So yeah, I'm not sure how these events kind of really show Germany's support for Jewish artists. Actually, they're showing a quite selective support, right?
And maybe the case of Lahav Shani is very important because he was disinvited as the director of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. He was not disinvited neither as a Jew, because of identity, nor even as an Israeli citizen. He was as a representative of this orchestra, which is a state-funded orchestra. This was the reason. So this is important to understand because this is not about political opinion. You know, this is not about an artist saying, or even, now we are in the middle of the Berlinale, the film festival. So it's not about a director saying, talking against the Israeli government. It's not important. It's not even important the content of the film. What is important is how is it financed and how much does it rely on cultural institutions? And BDS says in general that all these institutions, Israeli cultural institutions, unless proven otherwise, are complicit in maintaining the Israeli occupation and denial of basic Palestinian rights. So a question to you, what makes Israeli cultural institutions complicit in maintaining occupation?
Well, there's a few things going on here, I think. One is, like the universities, they play a role in this kind of free liberal society that you have, that people can just do what they want in terms of cultural production. And it is, again, about this kind of image of a democracy in the Middle East, the so-called villa in the jungle. Now, the way the BDS is set up is that the BDS is not against individuals, but against the institutions that are supportive of the state. So the Philharmonic gets money directly from the Israeli government, and therefore this person's invitation was canceled. Not about who he is. This person is irrelevant to the decision itself. If I was the composer or the director of the Philharmonic, regardless of my views, if I came on that, I would be boycotted.
If it was a Palestinian Israeli, he would be boycotted.
He would be boycotted, yes. And there have been instances like that. And so the boycott says that if you come representing an institution that is part of the state, then you will be boycotted, and it is based on the South African model. The Palestinians sat and learned the South African model, and the idea is that we don't start blacklisting people, okay, and saying his political views are kosher, their political views are not kosher. We're going for those that are affiliated with the institutions, and those we do not allow. And again, the BDS here is making a very important distinction that in Germany is being ignored, because it's not about the person, It's not about the Jew. It is about the government and its policies and its actions and its practices. That's what it's about. And so this conflation of the BDS with the Jew is a move made here in Germany, also by Israel, but here in Germany as a way to delegitimize BDS. And it's all part of a kind of delegitimization campaign, because BDS is considered by Netanyahu as one of the three major threats to Israel. It is, and Israel has now just, I read in the past 2 weeks that Israel is investing 2 billion shekels in fighting BDS and different, 2 billion. Okay,
what effect does BDS already have on the economy? Some people say that there's already a silent boycott. You know, company owners say that, you know, they are being disinvited with other arguments, not saying that we are boycott, but they are being afraid of maybe contracts being then withheld. So how effective is BDS? Is it already having an impact on Israel's economy?
There's disagreement here. I don't think so.
Not at all, because there was a...
On the economy, you're asking. Now, but the way I see it, these kinds of things is that they're incremental, and you need to go through different stages, and then suddenly something can just boom and happen overnight. And you don't know when that overnight is coming. Like the first Intifada, it's not as if, it didn't begin in December 10th, 1987, because throughout the 80s, Palestinians were throwing stones at the military in their villages. But one day it began. Okay? So the same with BDS. You do these small campaigns in your community, in your circle, in your thing. They add up. You manage to stop Lord from coming to Israel to present. You manage not to do A, B, and C. Slowly these things and these stories connect, and one day, and we don't know when that day is, but one day they do connect. And when they do connect, the economy suddenly, so there are some economic successes. I'm not saying there aren't. Viola decided not to make the light train. There's a whole series of, we can count, but we can count them in 2-3 hands. It's not major yet. And you can look at Israel's economy. Israel's economy is doing well. The cafes are full, the cinemas are full, and so forth. So there is a movement, there isn't, but we're on a marathon here.
And you were talking about rugby. Now, what would be a comparable dear thing to Israelis, for example, to affect them in a psychological way? Because you were stressing this psychological effect.
Let me very quickly just comment on this issue about the economy. And I think that the Israeli economy is being presented as in great health. I don't actually believe it is. And I tell you why I say that. I've had contact with, I suppose one would describe them as liberal Zionists who've been in the Israeli public service their whole careers. And a number of them have said to me, the economy, the fundamentals of the economy are actually in crisis because of the costs of the genocide. I'm writing a book at the moment called Making a Killing, how the West profits from slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. And if you look at the amount of money that Israel has spent on weaponry, even when it's getting weaponry at very good prices, it is having, I think, a significant impact on the fundamentals of the Israeli economy. And that makes that economy vulnerable. And that's why I think, if anything, BDS in this moment becomes even more important. And I agree, it is a marathon. As I said to you, the ANC was formed in 1912. But I think there are certain moments, and I think this might be one of them. On the sporting front, you know, I can't speak obviously as an Israeli, but you look at the issue of football, for instance. You know, and you look at the fact that there is this Israeli club, Maccabi Tel Aviv, who has notoriously thuggish fans. And, you know, the British government, under my own local MP, Keir Starmer, who fortunately looks as though he's on the way out, has done whatever it can to defend these thugs, to the extent that a government minister actually said when the fans were stopped from coming to a game they were playing in Birmingham against an English Premier League team, that Jews were stopped from watching football in Britain. I mean, I'm a season ticket holder at my local football club. I was watching football. There were a whole lot of Jews at the game. They just weren't Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters. I think there are certain sports that are quite central to a country's identity, or at least to the identity as understood by certain sectors of that society. And the only good thing about the sports boycott for South Africa, where we do take our sport, and particularly rugby and cricket, very seriously, is for decades and decades we could say we were the world champions because no one had beaten us because we couldn't play against anyone. But the reality is that it had a very palpable impact on the society, to the extent that the apartheid state spent tens of millions of rands on bringing what were called rebel teams to play against South African teams. So basically sports people, mainly from Britain, but from a few other places as well, who were prepared to ditch their principles in order to make a whole lot more money than they normally would playing their sport. And I think this showed the desperation and how important sport is. In the case of Israel, though, I think there is also another poignance that we shouldn't forget. And that is that immediately, and quite correctly in my opinion, that Russia invaded the Ukraine, Russia was banned from all sorts of sport, including from football competitions. Israel has slaughtered, and I'm going to probably get this figure wrong, but the last figure I remember seeing, which might have been well surpassed by now, is something like 48 or 49 footballers, including someone who was referred to as the Palestinian Pele, have been murdered by the state. But FIFA and UEFA will not bring in any sort of suspension of Israel. Now, because Israel's pretty useless at football, I'm not sure how much actual material difference it would make to any football competition, but I do believe that it would make a fundamental difference to the psyche of Israeli society. And just to repeat, the purpose of these boycotts is to make the population who benefit from this iniquitous, indefensible political system understand that there are costs to the continuation of the system. That's the crucial thing about them.
Now, we all agree that Israel very much relies on the support of the US and Germany. And so in Germany, there was a whole case constructed to delegitimize BDS. And Sophia, you were already mentioning the resolution, but formally, maybe going back to that point and to clarify things here, how illegal or legal BDS is in Germany. In fact, it's a political non-binding resolution, a cross-party statement. But it is kind of used as a law, right? But there were some court cases that afterwards, for example, they were saying that authorities cannot deny a venue, for example, on the basis of BDS promotion. So can you clarify a little bit, where are we today?
Yes.
Because we have 2 more resolutions now for the fight against antisemitism, so where do we stand now?
Yeah, so it has not only been one case that's been constructed, and I think it's also not just Germany, right? So one of the things to say is that in 2015, the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs has declared BDS a strategic threat. So especially BDS activity abroad, like in Germany, and following this kind of declaration, there were several, not just in Germany, but also in the US, several federal states started to draft these resolutions, right, that would kind of bind people to not support a boycott. So it was kind of these like anti-BDS resolutions that would often, I mean, in the case of Germany, I'm sure that it's similar in the US, kind of deny public space, etc., to anyone who would support the boycott. As Neve was saying, some research came out just a couple of weeks ago saying that the Israeli Department of Justice hired 2 law firms, 2 European law firms. One of them is this Chase, something Chase, whatever, a British law firm and another Belgian one that supported the Israeli government also in kind of figuring out the best legal tactics to address and oust BDS from these public spaces. And so in Germany, the first of these resolutions happened on a city level. So in Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin, city councils kind of passed these resolutions condemning the movement, banning anyone from participating. And in Frankfurt, for example, this was the mayor at the time, Uwe Becker, who was also the president of the German-Israeli Society, etc., etc. And later in 2019, this resolution was put to a vote in front of parliament. And I think here it's also important to say that this was a resolution that came from the far-right AfD. So the first draft came from them. It was then adapted and changed by different parties, but at the end, all parties represented in parliament proposed a version of this resolution, all of them condemning the BDS movement. And the version that passed after created this quasi-legal effect because it effectively asked publicly funded institutions to not invite anyone, etc. So initially, this also legally there were different ways of challenging this legally on the account that
they were all lost. I mean, the cases in front of the courts were all lost. I mean, the venues had to be in Munich, for example. I remember there was a case.
Exactly. So at the beginning, this kind of what happened was that individuals would say, okay, I'm being discriminated, like my right to freedom of expression, my right to freedom of assembly is violated because this non-binding resolution is forcing me is kind of forcing me out, right? And these cases were won on a very local legal level, so in constitutional courts, lower constitutional courts. But in 2020, a larger campaign, also supported by the ELSC, started against still trying to challenge the Bundestag's resolution. So it's a legal challenge against the Bundestag, which first passed in front of the constitutional courts.
It's now going to the federal constitutional
and
court.
Now, first it passed through the administrative courts because this is a dispute between three activists and one of whom has passed away already. But yeah, between three activists and the German parliament. And now at the last stage, it was decided to now go to the constitutional court. But I think also, even after this case has been heard at the Constitutional Court, there was already a BDS case in front of the European Court of Human Rights. So I think these are longer legal struggles that are going to continue to happen.
But it's not illegal. Right now, BDS in Germany is not illegal.
No, it's not illegal. It's protected by freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But there are obviously so many different ways that try to criminalize BDS. So one thing, for example, just last year is that several BDS groups in Germany were listed by the Domestic Intelligence Agency. Were listed in the Domestic Intelligence Report as secured extremist organizations, and they were listed as a form of secular Palestinian extremism in particular. And so this also didn't only affect BDS groups per se, but also other groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, Palestine Speaks, and often their listing was also connected to support for BDS, whether they're a BDS group or not. So this kind of goes beyond that. And listing in this domestic intelligence report doesn't only mean that these people could be surveilled, but also that they're considered enemies of the Constitution, right? So if they're trying to apply for public or government jobs, they're often there are checks for unconstitutional activity or not. When people try to apply for citizenship, this will be flagged up for sure. So this has quite far-reaching consequences. And just one last thing, because you mentioned the new anti-Semitism resolution. So there's an anti-Semitism resolution that was passed in parliament last December. No, 2 years ago, 2024. And this one, again, kind of tried to say, so far, BDS has not been able to be banned, right? But every now and again, the government tries to find a way or says that they're committed to doing it. And we've been seeing it for not more than 7 years now. And so in this resolution, they said it again as well. And also there, they said that BDS is part of a larger trend that is so-called imported anti-Semitism. So this is a discourse that started after 2015 and increasing migration from Syria, where like pro-Palestine activity and BDS support, expressions of BDS support, were cast as this like imported form of anti-Semitism. And this also found its way into this anti-Semitism resolution. And the AfD thanked the coalition for putting it in there because they took kind of ownership of this word, and they said, now even the Greens and the SPD, they're even borrowing from our vocabulary, and they were very proud of this, but it also shows us something of this kind of political trajectory where this is moving. And the resolution also said that the state should really use all tools of the arsenal of criminal law that it has and expand all of its tools to fight what it considers anti-Semitic campaigns like BDS.
But nobody can forbid. Yes, I have a last question as well for you, and maybe you can. Yes.
To this, that even if it doesn't have the law on its side, the chilling effect has already been done. So students, academics, my field, where I was the head of the Committee on Academic Freedom in the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, and we received many complaints from Germany and of people that were in a gray way, that they suddenly found out couldn't get grants, couldn't get prizes, couldn't get anything. And then you're thinking, I want to advance in my career, I'm a young student. If I post something on social media, they're going to go after me and not give me a job afterward. So in many ways, it has already been successful as a kind of chilling and silencing effect of a speech that is a human rights speech.
Now, what could be a sign of hope in this? This is my last question, then we're opening for your questions. Sorry, thank you very much for being so patient. I have maybe two last questions for you. One last question would be, for example, what would give you hope? I have a colleague of mine, Hannu Hauenstein, he just made a research on Israeli wine, proving that, what is declared to be Israeli wine, in fact, was coming from the occupied territories. And he was in contact with certain supermarket chains, and one supermarket chain then withdrew at least some wines from the assortment, and another one now declares it as settler wines, which is a success to a certain extent. So, and nobody can force you to buy things. I mean, nobody can force, even if you're not interested in BDS as a movement, but you can still make your own decisions, right? As a consumer, at least. So my question is, what would be the most effective measures or tools from your perspective, maybe both of you or the three of you, against Israel as a system, as a regime, as an apartheid state, as you frame it? What, is it about traveling? Is it about visa? Is it about Eurovision, because they love Eurovision in Israel? So what would be something that would really affect people in Israel to the extent that you would wish them to be affected, for them to wake up?
I don't think there's a silver bullet, that one thing that will happen that will bring about change, and I don't think it's healthy to think that way.
But some advice for the German audience maybe here. What the Germans could do even...
So my advice I gave before, and the advice is that you look what your comparative advantage is, you look to what workplace you belong to, what is your community, and you try to make the change there. The Greenpeace in the 70s had this wonderful slogan, think globally, act locally. And so it's obvious to me that we need to act locally. I act locally. And every one of us needs to create a story. And we need to constantly create new stories. This is a story, this meeting. And we need to create more and more and more of these stories, and particularly now. Now, because the genocide has transformed from a genocide to a slow-mo. It's the genocide, despite the ceasefire, is continuing. Daily Palestinians are being killed. Aid is not coming in. There's no medical system. There's this slow death going on in Gaza, and it's not making the news like it did before. And now is the time that we can't just sit back. Now is the time that we need to push forward and continue to make these stories. So when Ido wrote me and said, would you come to Berlin? And I said, of course, because he's creating, the three of them are creating here a story, and I want to be part of this story, and you're part of this story, and we just need to continue doing that. And that's my hope, because what we saw after the attacks, we saw, and particularly in London, you guys, you didn't see it as much, we saw this massive global mobilization for Palestine. Now that global mobilization did not come from nowhere. That global mobilization was decades of work of activists. And suddenly things fell into place. And we need to continue that. We need to continue that kind of activism in the streets, on social media, anywhere we can, and we create that hope through our actions.
No, this is not, yes, okay, no, sorry. There's a famous quote. It's not by Mahatma Gandhi, although people think so. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. So what stage is BDS currently in?
I think it's very difficult to say. I have a very unpopular view, which is that the boycotting of Eurovision comes as a huge relief to me, I have to say, because I land up having to watch it with my kids, and I'm not a fan. But to be more serious, very quickly, because I know we're stretched for time, but I had to leave South Africa in 1986. 48 hours notice. The night before I left Cape Town, the city of my birth, I was on a little hill called Signal Hill overlooking the city. And I thought, never again in my lifetime will I set foot in the city or country of my birth. Because in the mid-1980s, if somebody had told me that this mighty apartheid military machine with huge support from the West was in any danger of collapsing, I would have used my training in clinical psychology and offered them a straitjacket. It was such, the mid-80s in South Africa was such a time of darkness, extreme repression, the murder of activists, including children. It was horrific. The reality is that 4 years later, 4 years, our political prisoners were released, the ANC was unbanned, our real exiles, because I never regarded myself as a real exile, our real exiles and people like myself were allowed to return home. A further 4 years after that, so 8 years after I'd had to leave, Nelson Mandela was elected as our first ever democratic president. So within these moments of incredible darkness, like we are experiencing today, the reality is the scintillas of light start to emerge through the sorts of actions that Neve is talking about, through the resilience and courage of the Palestinian people. And these moments of extreme darkness are the moments that give way to the light. So every little bit of activism we are all doing at a time like this has never been as important. And you know, when Nelson Mandela emerged from 27 years in an apartheid prison, it was an extraordinary thing to say when you've just come out. Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. An extraordinary statement, but it shows the interconnection of our struggles in South Africa and in Palestine. But he said something else as important when he was asked how he had retained hope. during these awful 27 years of hard labor, of abuse, etc., etc. And he said, because I had faith in our people and in the people of the world who supported our struggle. And because I believe fundamentally that anything, even something as overwhelming as defeating a racist apartheid system, is only impossible until it's done. And that is the spirit that we need to maintain in our solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Thank you. So we are seeing the politician. We are seeing the politician Andrew here. Very nice final words. Do you want to continue with questions, or shall we leave this final word, as it was very moving? But I suppose you have questions. We will collect a few questions from people sitting next to each other. Is there anybody here, over there? No, not in this side, so we'll move over there. Let's start over there. There are 3 people. Please.
Thank you so much for this very interesting panel. I wanted to ask, especially within the German left and the progressives, but especially the left and leftist people, they found this narrative labeling BDS activists or Palestine solidarity activists as authoritarian by coercing supposed innocent or unpolitical artists or institutions, politicians, into their own positions. But meanwhile, it is authoritarianism itself BDS is opposing. So how would you respond to such a claim, especially if the people voicing it understand themselves as leftists?
Thank you. Yes, please.
I have 3 questions. First to Mr. Gordon. You said you should fight. Do you understand?
Yes.
Yeah. Here. You would fight for BDS until the regime has been defeated. What do you mean by regime? Do you mean the Israeli state? Do you mean a state with a majority of Jewish people living in there? Second thing, when BDS says in her founding declaration, all Arab lands that are colonized, I can only understand it that they want to get rid of this Israeli state. And elsewhere they are selective. They cite the UN resolution of right of return. They don't cite, correct me if I had written wrong, they don't cite the resolution of 47 of 2 states. Yes, number 242. The third thing is, again to Mr. Gordon directly, you said you don't care what the Palestinians would do. I think in this room we all agree more or less that the role of the Israeli state, army, etc., is very important in this decade-long conflict because they have the weapons, they have infrastructure, they have technology, etc. But I heard nothing here in this room about the role of the Palestinians, of the Arab states who are boycotting Israel since the 40s, about Iran who wants to destroy the new Iran, wants to destroy Israel. How can I trust these people? At least I must negotiate with them. And I think for this, peaceful Palestinians also need peaceful Jewish Israelis to negotiate with. If you drive them all out, there is no negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much. And a third person was over there. Okay.
I want to say that in comparison to the 80s, in which we had a strong UNO and a global feminist peace movement, which we don't have now, I have always been declining BDS as bold democracy, solidarity, and it has become ever more true. Since I have been, since 20 years I was in the Jüdische Stimme, and we were organizing the EU lobby for the boycott, people, but very normal boycott for every day, people buying things in the shops, and it was always countered by the Israeli regime by just tricks, writing the information in Ivrit or other tricks. So, okay, I know a bit about it, but I want to say that we have now, all the authoritarianism has grown so much by this conflict that we need to think further. And I am a bit afraid, because we had also, Sheheva was always declining how the Israeli state is going bankrupt, and it is still not, because I have fear. In the 80s, the feminists had described how there's automatisms on the ground when they're in conflict against the women. And now we need to decline this on the big level, because I fear that now Israel economy has changed into a war economy. And now, for example, Germany is buying the new arms. And so if we get into these new automatisms, that authoritarianism and war economy and fossil war economy, they are on the global level. So the demand for bold democracy, solidarity is everywhere. So that
So the
is
question is,
another question that we need to think about, how we can describe these automatisms. And then comes the Iranian side, because we have never thought about how we boycott the warmongers on both sides. And we must also think about this, because it's another strategy. It's another strategy to boycott war. And I don't know, we are not there yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we are giving this back to the panel. Maybe Andrew, you can say something about the last question on new strategies. If we have a war economy and this automatisms that have changed Israel as a state and as a regime, and this maybe needs new strategies. If I understand this well, boycott war on every side. But maybe Neve, you want to start with the different points that were made.
About BDS and authoritarianism, or in academia, you get that the role of academia is cooperation, and we need dialogue, and how can you support BDS? So what I recommend here would be to go to the AAUP website. AAUP is the American Association of University Professors. It's the Union of Professors. And their latest statement, they for years were against BDS. They now support the BDS. And the way they explain it is, first they make that claim, like you say, that is made against you. But then they claim that sometimes, in order to defend academic freedom and the rights of academics, you need to use boycott, okay? So there's a total erasure in that claim of this kind of violation that is taking place, and that the boycott is being used. And that's why I emphasize that the boycott is not a principle, it's a strategy. When these violations end, we will deal with it. So I think sometimes you need to use mechanisms like boycott in order to end bigger forms of domination and oppression. Regarding what do I mean by regime, I would say that I think in 1994 there was a regime change in South Africa, and yet we still have South Africa. That's what I mean by regime change.
Now there was another question.
So this idea of saying and putting words that when someone says we need a regime change because we have an apartheid regime, we have a settler colonial regime, and someone says, when I say we need a regime change, that is basically the elimination of the Jews, that's the last thing in the world that I would think of. I'm thinking of a society where the inhabitants of the land are equal. It's not a big request. The idea about the Palestinian state in the BDS is not, again, it's not my role to answer, but you asked me. I think the reason it's not there is because there's an indecision of whether we want among the organizers of the BDS, whether they wanted the two-state solution or whether they wanted a democratic state from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean Sea for everyone. And those were the two options. And therefore, both are legitimate options from their perspective, or at least when they wrote that document then. It was there, and that's why I understand. But it is a human rights-based approach based on either on the most basic right, the self-determination of the Palestinian people, and that self-determination can manifest itself in any way, and there's no eliminationist project whatsoever. It's something that is being read into the BDS. It does not exist in the BDS. And finally, regarding the kind of villa in the jungle perspective that you presented, look at all those Arab warmongering states around this villa. But look who's the warmonger in this jungle. It is the villa. It is the villa. I mean, Israel has attacked 7 countries since October 7th. 7 countries have been attacked by Israel. I'm not saying that...
I mean, Hezbollah started to send rockets after October 7th to stand by Hamas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying
nothing
that there
began
was
in October 7th.
I know,
I'm just saying...
We agree on that. I'm just completing the argument, saying that.
The point is, I'm not pro... I just want to emphasize, though, I'm not pro most of these regimes. They're authoritarian thugs at the head of most of them. Okay? It's not something that it's not... But to present Israel as different is not very clear to me, because Israel, in terms of violence, in terms of violation of international law, etc., it has a problem.
Andrew.
I'm going to add a couple of very, very quick things to this, and I'm very happy to answer questions in more detail, more comprehensively afterwards. So forgive me for being so brief. The first question about, these artists who are sort of pushed into boycott, or sports people, or whatever the case is, it proposes some sort of passivity on the part of these people, as though if you're talented in the field of creativity, you're stupid. Which, the artists I've dealt with are anything but. I mean, there's one artist who I dealt with on the AIDS campaign in South Africa when we had a president who was an AIDS denialist. And this particular artist insisted, at her own expense, going to South Africa, speaking to women living with AIDS in rural areas, and figuring out whether the organization we were asking her to become involved in actually did anything of benefit to these people. I was so impressed with the way she actually researched and thought about what we were asking her. Then, I got a call one day from a rapper who said, "You might not know me, my name's Loki," or Kareem Dennis. And I said, "Yeah, you'll be shocked to hear that this almost 60-year-old person knows nothing about hip-hop and rap." He said, "I'd like to come and see you and just play this song I did for you based on some work you did." So I said, "Great." He came along and he played me this sort of 4-minute track. And I was both exhilarated because it was absolutely brilliant and it was going out to someone who has a far bigger audience than I'll ever have. And I was furious because he had said in 4 minutes would have taken me 555 pages and 3,000 footnotes to say, and he'd said it better than me. These are very smart people. They're making decisions on their own. I think sometimes they make decisions, occasionally, where you have to give them additional information when people do decide to go and perform in Israel or things like that. But I think this notion of them as sort of passive recipients of this political pressure does them a huge disservice. Quickly on the second question, you know, how can we trust these people to negotiate with them? The question is put a different way often. Where is Palestine's Mandela? Well, I'll tell you where. Either in jail, like Marwan Barghouti, for 22 years and counting, or they've been killed. You know, I've spent a lot of time both in Israel and in the occupied territories. And like during the South African liberation struggle, the Palestinian liberation struggle has a whole range of extraordinarily impressive people involved, generations, not just one generation, but through generations. And I think we do a disservice because we don't know much about these people, just as we did in South Africa. You know, the notion that was all we had was Mandela. I mean, there was this extraordinary group of leaders, of whom Mandela was one of his generation. And then there were 2 generations of leaders under them. Most of them were in jail or in exile. So I think we just need to bear that in mind. And then very quickly, you know, the authoritarianism has grown so much. Israeli economy is a war economy. A war, you know, you often think, oh, a war economy does incredibly well during war. Well, actually it doesn't, because in Israel's case, it has to buy a huge amount of its military hardware from elsewhere. It makes certain types of weaponry, but that's quite limited. And I think the reason that if we saw the true picture of the Israeli economy, which is not what's being given to us by the Israeli treasury at this point, I think we would see an economy that is in far worse shape than they would like us to believe. And if one looks at the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that Israel is having to spend on equipment to keep this genocide going and to continue to attack the other 6 countries that it has attacked during this period, I think we will see a very different sort of picture. The final thing I want to say is all of these things are nuanced. So we talk about Iran. You know, it is actually possible to oppose the Iranian regime, and I use the word regime intentionally in this case, which is not a regime that I can identify with in any way, but also be concerned about the American and Israeli influence over those very brave and courageous people who are protesting that regime and who are actually in some instances sacrificing their lives to take on that regime. The world is nuanced. These struggles are nuanced. It doesn't mean, as our leaders keep on telling us, they're far too complex for us to understand. It's just that we don't have to think that if we raise certain concerns about Ukraine, like the level of corruption in that government and in the arms buying component of that corruption, which is something I've done a lot of work on, that doesn't mean you're a supporter of Putin or what I regard as Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. It is possible for these views to exist coterminously, and I think that's incredibly important.
This is, by the way, the theme of next month's panel on March 19, protest movements around the world, shared solidarity and strategies for mobilization, to think all of these things together and not against each other. Yes.
Can I just answer or quickly respond to the first question? Because I think what I also heard from your question was a bit this, okay, so it's 2026 now, right? There are still people in Germany, a big majority on the left, who keep kind of referring to BDS as a form of harassment, people standing in front of stores, kind of trying to speak to people about complicity of these companies, and that is also, there's a fraction in the left, right? That's also what I'm hearing from you. So I didn't, because it was very hard to follow Nelson Mandela, I also want to share something that gives me hope in Germany, so that we don't leave here thinking that, you know, lock the castle, throw the keys, whatever. There is, despite the fact that the German state tries to throw everything at people who are organizing for Palestine, etc., there is now, a month ago, was the first academic boycott conference in Germany, and they initiated, students now, finally, initiated a nationwide boycott and divestment campaign. So this is really huge because this has never existed in Germany, right? When I got to learn about BDS, like I was in university, people were organizing boycotts of their, of their whatever student council, of like whatever. This was years ago, but this is happening in Berlin, in Germany now, nationwide, which is really a huge success. There's also people who are organizing against Allianz, for example, this insurance company. They had a huge success in December, where Allianz actually dropped Elbit Systems contracts, so this huge weapon supplier to Israel, which is a huge success. And these are all campaigns that people can get involved with, so you don't have to talk to leftist Germans who are just, talking about, that this is harassment, etc.
Okay, thank you very much for these signs of hope. We'll take one last round of questions. The gentleman over there. 2 more people, or will this be the last question? Okay, and 2 in the front. Okay. We're waiting for the microphone, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you for the brilliant debate. First, I would like to make a brief remark on the Bundestag resolution. I mean, in Germany, many cultural venues are government-sponsored. And I think it's safe to assume this space doesn't receive any government funding whatsoever. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this debate here. Because otherwise, the opinions of the antisemitism commissioners would matter. And they all draw on the IRA resolution and so on. Andrew Feinstein talked about the dark times we are in. You gave us just like moments ago some hope. I don't want to excuse the Germans, but the main supporter and the decisive supporter of Israel is the United States. And we can't have a debate about it. This is just a fact. And so I think there's a sea change in the younger generation in the United States with regard to Israel. And I think it's playing out in the primaries right now in the Democratic Party. And it is playing, it's not people we necessarily like, but it's also playing out on the American right now with like the former Fox host news, Tucker Carlson. So does this give hope to you? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we have 2 questions here in the front, sorry too. Yes.
Just a short question for you. The BDS movement had a stance on the movie No Other Land and also on the movement Standing Together. And I would like to hear your opinion, or maybe you can explain to the audience what this is about.
Thank you.
And maybe coming back to Germany, I feel like there are almost contrary developments. On the one side, public opinion is opening up, people are becoming more critical. The polls show that opinion has shifted, and even opinions of people who work in ministries, public institutions, if you speak to them, they're actually much more frank now in their criticism of Israel and their opinions also about apartheid, genocide, and so forth. And you feel also, while this was the only space in Berlin 2 years ago where you could have discussions like this, now there are more events and discussions taking place elsewhere. Here it felt like almost a clandestine kind of place 2 years ago, and now I think discussions have opened up. But all while this is happening, policies are becoming more repressive, and I think for a reason, because actually opinion is shifting, politicians feel they actually have to crack down even more with the help of course, of Israeli propaganda and all its auxiliaries in Germany. I mean, there's so many institutions that supposedly work on anti-Semitism that have sprung out of nowhere with massive funding. So it's not only the Israeli embassy now, but so many others, institutions that are suddenly experts on anti-Semitism and so forth. And I wonder how long this actually can be kept up. Because public momentum has gone down again. Gaza is out of the news, the big demonstrations are not happening anymore. And it's not really an issue that is deciding elections here. So politicians can go on with this without actually feeling any pain, you know, any real pressure from the street, apart from still leftists, migrants, and so forth, people who can be marginalized very easily, kind of raising their voices. So when does maybe you cannot even give that answer because it's different to every place, but when does this point come when politicians cannot ignore the public anymore?
Thank you very much. Big question. I wonder whether anybody on the panel wants to answer that. Or maybe we start with a easier one on the films. Neve, that went
Regarding
to you.
the film,
Yes.
my again, I think it was a mistake. Not because there's a picture of me in the film from the archives, but because I think it's a really important film. The reason is that it received some funding from I don't remember the details, but some funding from some body that they said it wasn't supposed to be. But because my view is, again, because BDS is strategic, you sometimes need to make a strategic move, even if it's against your guidelines, to allow for this because this film is so important. That's my view. Regarding your question, what is going on is there's a struggle over the common sense in Gramsci's terms. Okay, so hegemony creates what is common sense. And the government suddenly understood that they no longer control the common sense. That's what's going on. And this added repression that you're describing is exactly because of the threat, because this understanding that they have lost the common sense. And it's not only among the marginalized and the leftists. The vast majority of people now understand that what is going on there is genocide. It's wrong. And the government support of it is wrong. They've lost the common sense. And what hegemony does when it loses the common sense is it becomes more coercive. Okay, so I think we need to understand it as a sign of success, okay, this kind of move. But, as you said, we can't just kind of lay back now. Now we need to continue. We just need to continue controlling the common sense, distributing it, circulating it until, and then in the next elections, in the local elections, run people for the, councils and cities on these kinds of tickets. We need to slowly kind of take over. And it's a slow process. It takes time, but I think there has, as we both agree, a change has happened. And that's very important. And now we need to think how to sustain it and enlarge it.
Sophia, a comment on the German.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. This is a sign where there's continuous mobilization and resistance. There's also this form of massive state repression. And I think we see this in our data. We follow this every time there's when in 2021 people were mobilizing at large for the Unity Intifada. Was the biggest Nakba Day protest in Berlin to that day. It was a huge mobilization. Next year, Nakba Day protests were banned completely, right? Blanket ban. The following year, blanket ban. All Nakba demonstrations. Today there was a judgment by the administrative court, I think, that ruled them to be partially illegal at least. So this is not the win, but the win was that then in October 2023 there was a blanket ban again on all Palestine protests for weeks. There was checkpoints in Neukölln, and the ban was lifted because people went to the streets continuously. They continued to go out and protest, and eventually the ban was lifted, right? So since then, there have been obviously restrictions of protest, but also this was a sign of a big success. There have been, the same thing happens, so but these kinds of, there's also development of the tactics. So when From the River to the Sea was criminalized as a slogan of Hamas here in Germany, right? Of a proscribed terrorist organization, this led to thousands of cases still pending. Last summer, there were a few positive verdicts clearing activists of the use of this, or clearing them that the slogan does not constitute a symbol of a terrorist organization. And a few lawyers who won these cases came out with a statement saying, okay, police and state prosecution, you need to stop prosecuting the slogan because these courts have decided it's not justified, your prosecution. The police and the state prosecution came out to say, yeah, we're going to continue for now, you know, because we still consider it to be. So it goes on and on and on, but there's also, I think, as Neve was saying, right, and as you also identified, if people do continue showing up and also revealing the absurdity of this, then there's also an end eventually.
Andrew, can you?
Your use of the term, she just used the term Nakba, as if everyone understands what Nakba means.
Here everybody does.
Okay, everybody does. Why? Okay, now that's very important. That shows that we've changed the common sense, that everyone knows what the Nakba means.
Andrew, can you talk a little bit about the US? There was a question.
Yes, sure. So the first thing I'd like to ask Sophia is, if Netanyahu comes to Germany, they'll have to arrest him both in terms of the ICC warrant, but also for using the phrase "from the river to the sea" constantly, if they're still applying it, because he does all the time. I mean, it would be very weird. On the US, I mean, it's wonderful. And if you haven't seen it, there's a film called Israelism, which is really, I mean, it's fascinating to watch because of the journey of, I think it's 3 young Americans. And I mean, I do obviously feel slightly ambivalent about, you know, the sort of the right who've now, I mean, taken on the cause of Palestine and hold a whole lot of other, frankly, terrifying views. But it is a reflection that the right wing of American politics, that Trump has thought he has wrapped up for all eternity, do not see the advantages for the United States of America of its alliance with Israel. And these people are incredibly influential. And if you combine that with the changing attitudes, not just of young Americans, and by young, I think the polls are talking about people under the age of 37. I mean, that makes me a geriatric at this point. But, I mean, I think that coming together of different generations is absolutely fascinating. And it has real consequences for Israel and Israel's propaganda. And I think that that is something, and of course it's incredibly minor by comparison to the human suffering. But this too is a consequence of its simply indefensible actions in Gaza, that so many people are so conscious of this. And I'm not sure that in decades there has ever been as great a disconnect between leaders, so-called, let's call them rulers rather, and their citizenry as there is over this issue. And I think it shows a disconnection of the political class generally that feels more and more removed from the reality of all of our everyday lives. And that's not just a consequence of this, it's also a huge consequence of the influence of massive amounts of money in politics, which is obviously a whole different discussion, but one that I think is very important. I then quickly want to comment on the point that was made about, BDS and all of these strategies being strategic. We had the instance in South Africa towards the end of the cultural boycott, where Paul Simon came to South Africa and he made an album called Graceland with one of our best known Black African groups. And immediately the ANC's knee-jerk response was to criticize him and to ban him. And they then realized that Paul Simon is someone who's actually been quite supportive of the struggle, that huge numbers of black artists were thrilled by this, even though it technically violated the cultural ban. So to be fair, the ANC engaged with Paul Simon, and they came to a position ultimately where they embraced Graceland and his cooperation with Black African musicians, but explained why this shouldn't take place until South Africa was free any further. And it was a very good and very strategic intervention that was based on common sense. Just a couple of victories to bear in mind. You'll all be aware here that the Direct Action Group, Palestine Action, was prescribed as a terrorist organization in the UK. That we've had groups of young people who've been on remand for 15 months before their recent releases. That prescription has been declared unlawful by the courts in the United Kingdom. And our government, which is putrid in every possible respect, looks so pathetic, so out of touch, so stupid and so bad at politics at the moment, that it is a reflection of the completely unsustainable position they've taken on Israel and Gaza. And the biggest lesson we can show from South Africa is not actually about BDS. It's actually about what has happened since 1994. And yes, economic inequality is huge and horrific. And that's a struggle that we are still engaged in every single day. But if we can show Israel and Palestine one thing, and it's not our place to tell Palestinians what they should do with their historic land. That is something that they are going to resolve amongst themselves, and it's quite right that they do. Just as when the British and the Americans suggested to us we have some form of consociational democracy, whatever the hell that meant, we realized that it was just a way to avoid actual democracy, and no one listened to them. But there is one thing that South Africa can show, and that is despite over 350 years of effectively being engaged in a civil war against each other based on the color of our skins, we live incredibly harmoniously together. And the people who've adapted to that best have been the most right-wing Afrikaans-speaking white South Africans, the people who we were most worried about, who in the months leading up to our first democratic election were stockpiling everything, from toilet tissue to canned foods, because Armageddon was upon them. And they were told that Mandela, this communist ogre, was going to take their homes, their cars, their swimming pools, and rape their daughters and wives, and then drive those who remained into the sea. Bloody hell, you mention the name Mandela in South Africa. White people get more excited than black people now. So the reality is that we are able at certain levels to live together in one country incredibly harmoniously, despite the many, many racialized challenges that still remain. And as a consequence of that, I have to say finally, that as sure as we defeated apartheid in South Africa, with BDS, as I hope we've outlined today, playing an absolutely crucial role in that, so will we as global citizens end apartheid, occupation, and genocide in Palestine, because history is on our side.
Thank you for these very encouraging words at the end of the panel. Let me just make two small announcements, if I may. A quick preview at the end. In March, Zeit zu Reden organizes 3 events, one in Hamburg, one in Leipzig at the book fair, and on March 19th we are going to be back here at SPORE Initiative with this panel that I already promised about protest movements, shared solidarity, mobilization strategies, and this event will be moderated by my esteemed colleague Sonja Sekri. I'm already announcing this. Then, anything else you find on our website, we have a possibility to give feedback. And there are little papers with QR codes, so we very much appreciate whatever feedback you want to give us at Zeit zu Reden. There is a small table outside where you can make a donation, talking about solidarity, donation for families in Gaza. The money that you give there goes directly, is transferred to families in need on the ground in Gaza. Many thanks to my panelists. Many thanks to SPORE for hosting us. Thank you for your patience, for listening and discussing. Stay critical, stay engaged, and see you back at Zeit zu Reden. Thank you.